So we're going to talk about going into business with people, and to a large degree, I guess I'm a little bit of an imposter here because my credibility in this regard is somewhat limited because essentially I'm a loner, and my natural state is really working on my own, and to be honest, working on my own out of the front of my house. That's pretty much it. And the reason for that is that I like to make all the decisions. So a bit of a control freak in that regard. I'm a poor communicator generally. I don't particularly like conflict, so it's something I try and avoid if I can. I jump to conclusions, I take things personally. So basically I just don't play well with others. But I'm also probably one of the better qualified to talk about this topic because despite my sort of inherent nature, I've really persisted in going into business with people. And I've had limited success, so I've had about 6 law partnerships in various forms. I'm in a partnership in a real estate business, I'm in a partnership in a software business, I went into a partnership with 2 other people in a medical device business. And the reason I persisted in it is because when I looked at famous partnerships, something became apparent to me. The guy on the far left here is a guy called Thomas Edison. And his exploits are pretty famous. He spent, I think it was about 50,000 filaments that he experimented with before he sort of invented the modern light bulb. But the other 2 gentlemen on the right of him aren't so well known, but they were equally as important. The guy in the middle is John Pierpont Morgan, a famous financier. And the guy to the right of him is the sort of patriarch of the Vanderbilt family. And so although Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, it was not until he actually joined it with the capital of these gentlemen that he created the electricity industry and really laid the framework or the rails for the 20th century and the 21st century. These 2 guys are a couple of heroes of mine. They're Wilbur and Orville Wright, the Wright brothers. And when they were young, they were given a helicopter, excuse me, by their father. And I think that was sort of credited as sparking their interest in aviation. But then they went on, they invented a printing press and started their own newspaper, and then they went into a bike shop, which is quite famous. But later they then came back to aviation, and the famous flight at Kitty Hawk. This is a picture of flights currently in the air at any one point in time around the world. So those 2 gentlemen really shrunk the world. That was their contribution as their partnership. And what they had was a shared background, a shared family, shared values that made this possible for them. The lady on the left here is Chanel, and she invented the famous Chanel No. 5 perfume. The guy on the right is a guy called Pierre that she met 3 years later, who at that time had the biggest perfume business in France, and he was also a friend of the person who formed Galeries Lafayette, which is a famous department store in Paris. And so although Chanel was really good at perfume, it wasn't until she hooked up with Pierre that she really got the networks and connections that enabled her to become really the forefront person in really fashion. It created an industry, and she's now iconic for that. This is, I think, the original McDonald's store. The McDonald's brothers moved to California with the objective of making $1 million before they were 50. They actually sold, I think it was 25 franchises before they met a guy called Ray Kroc, who was a paper cup salesman. And he took a national franchise, and now there's, I think it's about 31,000 McDonald's stores around the world. So it was the marketing and the concept of franchising that enabled the business system that the McDonald's brothers came up with to become and really invent the modern takeaway or fast food industry. These 2 guys are well known. This is Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. And really it was a pairing of Wozniak's technical brilliance, if you like, and creativity with Steve Jobs' business acumen. And Steve Wozniak wasn't actually in the second coming of Steve Jobs as far as being his partner when he came back and Apple became the success it is today. But the way these 2 people related really became the template for the way Steve Jobs approached the second coming at Apple. And that was, it was quite openly admitted that he didn't really invent anything, or he wasn't very creative. He actually just found the best people with the best ideas, and then he would apply his business acumen to make it work. This is an instance of complementary opposites, where we've got Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, who's been on and off the #1 richest person in the world. And Warren Buffett's always been, he's had many financial partnerships. But this one is the one that I think he's the most proud of, and he says that he say, he can expose himself, he can show his weaknesses to Charlie, and Charlie then reflects on that and they create a better outcome. In fact, Warren is a supporter of the Democratic Party quite openly with Barack Obama, and Charlie is quite a strong supporter of the Republican Party. And they come together each day and work and create a strong partnership, even with those very divergent views. And in fact, it is those divergent views that makes them so strong. These guys shared a long history going to primary school together. So one of the things that Bill Gates says about Paul Allen is that they had this deep trust that enabled them to take on and really create the modern PC industry. These guys had a common background. They were children of academic migrants, and they started off trying to put the internet on a computer, and you probably all heard the story. And they came up with the idea of the concept of citations, which was from their academic upbringing. But their common purpose now was to really make the world's information available to everybody. And I think they've gone a pretty long way to doing that with Google. And this one is one of my favourites. This is the shed that Hewlett and Packard, and I think it was around the 1940s, started Hewlett Packard. And it was in the first half of the 1900s. And it really formed the template for a lot of the modern partnerships and common business enterprises in Silicon Valley. This is in Palo Alto. The reason, what I've sort of gained or taken away from these partnerships is that if you can't form working relationships, then your resources will always be limited. The partnerships can bring you cash. That's quite obvious. Partnering with someone with money or raising money. But partnerships can also bring you something other than cash. They can bring you talent, they can bring you friendships, they can bring you IP, they can bring you connections. And it's for these reasons that I think doing partnerships well is so important. Australia, all the examples I've given are US examples. So I typed in famous Australian partnerships in Google, and there wasn't not one famous partnership came up. Now, that sort of staggered me a little bit, so I thought about why is that the case? And I think it's because of our heritage. I think we're innately loners, and sort of we idealise the sort of the lone hero, the guy who's out there prospecting for a new mine. A lot of our famous entrepreneurs are family dynasties, so they've got family money as opposed to having to necessarily find money from other sources. And I think the area where we have a lot of partnerships or common business enterprises is in professional services. And from my observations, they're not the most stable of partnerships. There's no sort of iconic groupings of people. And in the new economy, I think even with respect to gaining access to cash, it's still reasonably limited in Australia as well. So I did do some further digging, and a few came up. So there's Lord Leonard Pank was an optometrist, now Australia's largest optometrist. It started between two guys in around 1906. R.M. Williams is an interesting one. So R.M. Williams sort of partnership with a guy called Dollar Mick, who was an outback character who was quite good with leather goods. Talent too, so Morgan and Banks is probably a partnership name that a lot of us have heard of. Sidney Meyer started out in business with his brother, but that only lasted a very short time in Ballarat. So we have if you actually dig deeper in the Australian entrepreneurial success stories, there are partnerships, but I just think it's really interesting that there aren't these iconic partnerships like there are in the US, and in the US it's even becoming, Twitter and eBay and all these other PayPal are all based around these famous groupings. So what have we learned from looking at those particular groupings? I think the first thing is that you need to understand the purpose of your partnership. And I'm not talking about we are here to open a shop or create a software program, whatever, but why are you going into partnership versus doing it yourself? What is it the thing that you're missing that you need by that grouping? Because if you don't actually clearly articulate that, then when things get tough, you probably won't stick it out. Then we try and take a number of issues off the table. So this is really where the guts of the legal stuff comes in and the planning. So we try to take issues off the table by thinking what are the things that are going to lead to dispute, and let's agree about them now when we're all feeling very friendly. And so when they arise, we've already got those things sorted out, and that forms quite a large part of the talk. And there's a couple of other things that, these are just my personal observations, but I think they're reasonably important, is to schedule time for what I call deliberate communication. So I think in partnerships what happens, and certainly in my experience what's happened, is it's all warm and fuzzy at the outset and everything's going well. But things creep in. Day-to-day contributions might not be equal or whatever it might be, but you don't know when and to what extent to raise that, to diffuse that issue, to let the tectonic plates move a little bit. So they tend to build up, and that's when they become out of proportion and cause problems. The other thing is to provide for meaningful value adjustment. A lot of people think, well, like at the beginning it was a 60-40 partnership or it was a 30-30-30 partnership. But the reality, things change, and you need to build adjustment into the way that you've structured that particular partnership, once again, so the tectonic plates can move without causing a big disruption. And finally, and this is probably an excuse for myself, but when the purpose is lost, when it's not being met, be prepared to get out. A partnership splitting is not a failure unless you've failed to plan for that ending. So, these aren't things that have to last forever to be worthwhile. So we'll just touch a little bit more on the purpose or the purposes that might be relevant to forming a common business enterprise. And the first one is access to talent. So that's one we've talked about. And that can be technical skills, sales and marketing, business acumen, qualifications or licenses, things that you don't have yourself that come together with your skills to create something more powerful. Access to new intellectual property is another one. Access to capital, which is cash. Access to networks, so marketing and expanding into new areas. Economies of scale. So a lot of partnerships and a lot of mergers between businesses are really to try and access some sort of a scale to get to spread their overheads or something like that. Reduction in competition. 2 businesses, 3 businesses come together and you're no longer competing against each other. To diversify your business into other areas where you see that there's things that are impacting on where you're currently carrying on your business. And to spread the load across more people to create capacity, whether it's machinery or talent. And finally, I'm going to touch on this point a little bit more, but to create a real business. And when I say real business, I mean a business that's the ownership of the business is separate to the active participation in the business. So that to me is a real business. If you need to turn up every day and your continuing participation or association with that business is that you actually have to turn up on some sort of a basis, I don't call that a real business because it's more of a job. I mean, it might produce a return over and above your wage, but there's still a limitation to it. So I've listed here some of the sort of more practical examples of what that might be. So being able to fund a product or spread fixed overhead, reducing variable overhead. So that's just really the next layer of the application of that purpose that I'm talking about. And the reason I touch on these things is because it's really important to maintain an eye on what that purpose is as you go through it and what you're actually trying to achieve from the outset. But there's 2 other purposes that I think probably are more at play. The first one is ego. I think that there is a lot of bigger is better, or even in the case of professional services, bigger is more secure. The more people I can get around me, the less chance that I'm not going to be able to generate the revenue next month or whatever it might be. And the problem with ego or size for the sake of size is that it's not enough. It's not a real purpose that's ultimately going to carry you through. And the other purpose that I think is probably equally as important as ego, and it's probably been one of the purposes that's driven me to form partnerships over my time, is company. Being an entrepreneur is lonely. And so you see other people doing the same thing as you, and you say, oh, well, wouldn't it be great to do that together? And although this is one of the biggest drivers, I think it's one of the more hollow purposes, because if there isn't one of these more fundamental underlying real purposes, it's certainly not going to endure. So once you've looked at the purpose, you need to say to yourself, is 1 + 1 going to equal 3, or is it going to equal 2, or is it going to equal 1.5? Basically, is the deal value accretive? And in making that assessment, you need to take into account the value of bringing these things together for this common purpose versus what I call relationship overhead. And relationship overhead is the fact that you can no longer make the decisions on your own. You've got to sit down and there might be 1 or 2 other people that you need to make that decision with. And the bigger, this is another thing I guess in the context of professional partnerships, is that the relationship overhead of those can very soon outweigh the real value created by bringing those businesses together, unless that's properly managed. So once you've got your purpose, I think it's important to build in to your documentation and your systems and your processes and the way you carry on your business something that ensures that you maintain focus on the reasons why you formed the partnership. So build in incentives to realise the business. If one of the things was you're going to spread your overheads or you're going to reduce your overheads, then somebody should be tasked with actually saying, okay, before we had 120, 2 lots of $60,000 of rent, now we've come together and it's your job to make sure that we're not paying 120 or 130, we're only paying 100. So we're actually realising those benefits. So write down what those value adds are, what those things you're trying to get out of it. And then what needs to be achieved, and then task someone to be responsible for that and to report back into the partnership forum. So I've talked about the reasons why you would go into business with people. But you might say, well, actually, yeah, I can't really identify a real purpose here. So what are my alternatives? The first one is to work harder yourself. So invest more of your own sweat equity. And there's only 2 alternatives. So the first one is just work harder yourself. And in a lot of cases, I think that makes sense. There are things that you can do just to take the business to the next level. And the other one is to make the equity that you've already invested or you've already got on the table work harder for you. And there's really only 2 ways to do that. One is to raise debt. That's the way to make your equity work harder. And the other one is to sell off non-performing assets or close down areas of your business that aren't performing and reinvest those resources or time into the thing that is making you money. So I think in a lot of cases that I have seen that, once again, in professional services and also to some degree in some startups, is that people overlook the option of raising debt and just buying what they need. Buying the extra person, buying the extra equipment, buying someone to develop your website as opposed to giving them 50% of your business to develop your website and then suddenly go, hang on, what on earth am I in business with this person who's, I've given 50% of my business away just because he can make a website that I could have got done for 40 grand. So in relation to debt, you can get a little bit creative. So you can use ordinary debt, you can finance equipment, you can use pre-orders of products. So basically you're promising to deliver something and you get paid a little bit up front, might be a deposit. Prepaid services and financing shares. And then there's some other little options here that you might be able to attract that talent without giving away so much equity by providing workplace flexibility. You might enter into an exclusive supplier arrangement with somebody in return for some cash, so that's another form of raising some capital without giving away equity. And you might also then look at like a franchising model where you're giving away exclusive access to territories as a way of raising money or resources. So in summary, I think it's important to write down your purpose. And the reason for this is that when things go wrong or when things get hard, you can reflect on what it was. And I've had personal experience in a recent legal partnership where I did write down my purpose, probably for the first time out of the 6 of them. And it was very comforting for me to acknowledge that the purpose was no longer being fulfilled. And therefore ending that partnership was not a failure. It had just run its course. So the next thing is, how do you choose your partners? And I think a question you need to ask yourself is that, are you making an active choice as to who you're going into business with, or are they choosing you? And in that respect, you need to do your due diligence. You need to find out whether they've performed. You need to look at previous work they've done. Maybe even do a couple of small projects with them. One of the partnerships I went into, I actually worked out of their offices for 6 months before we decided that we were going to do something a little bit more concrete. So we knew each other really well. We tested it out. The other thing is that a lot of people go into partnerships with friends and fellow employees, and think about what impact that would have if the partnership failed on your family and on your friendships. Is it worth it? Are they the appropriate people to go into business with? So understand their values and their ideas and their goals. I think that's important, and not just their professional ones, but also their personal ones, so that you understand that there's a fit. And you need to look for people that complement you but don't overlap, because the more they overlap, the more opportunity there is that things are going to go wrong and that you're going to fight over a particular area of control or have very strong views about the same topic. And once again, just there, the concept of going into business with friends and co-workers. And even if you do that, I think you really need to step back and have meetings and a discussion outside of the framework of that friendship, so not with a glass of red or not at work if you're co-workers. Find a different forum and actually discuss how we're going to do this as a business. We're going to come back to this concept of do you have a real business? Because I think this is one of the... I met with some people last week and we were talking about a business that 3 of them were putting together. They were all experienced business people. And one of the first things that came up, and it sort of took me aback because I wasn't expecting it, was that the 3 of them weren't actually going to work in the business. which I thought was great. So we're talking about coming together with this background and these complementary skills, and they were going to take a business and they effectively be at the board level. They weren't going to be at participation level. So they were creating a real business. Whereas I think a lot of professional services, and also I think, to some degree IT companies, etc., there's an expectation that your ownership of the business will only continue so long as your participation continues. So you need to ask yourself, where am I on that spectrum? Are we a big business like BHP? You buy a share in BHP, you don't expect to have a job at BHP or be on the board just because you're holding a share. But at the other end, if you don't turn up every day to a law firm as a partner, not too many days will go by before you get tapped on the shoulder. So where is your business on that spectrum? So the first stage about common business enterprise is getting into business. So what are the things that you need to think of at that stage? So what is the business going to do? So I have a checklist at this stage. This is where we sort of go into taking those issues off the table and starting to articulate why we're actually going into business together. So you need to write down, you need to have a strategy, you need to have a business plan. It seems pretty obvious, but you'd be amazed at the number of people who come to me for a partnership agreement or a shareholders agreement who still don't have a 2-page business plan and a strategy. What's the proposed term? Most people think, oh, well, this is going to last forever. I'm going to be the next Google. But a lot of businesses don't actually have a perpetual term. And certainly the purpose that's brought the people together isn't going to last forever. So you need to identify what that is. Also in the context of, say, when two existing businesses merge, one of the reasons they might merge is so that someone can get an exit. So if someone's looking at getting out in 5 years, you need to make that part of the structure by which you've come together so that you can facilitate that person's exit. Do you need any particular qualifications? Some things you can't do without like an AFSL license or a builder's license or whatever it might be. So what qualifications do you need? Do you need any particular key people to make the business work? And then we cover the question of structure, and I think this is where a lot of people get bogged down. A lot of people get bogged down in the tax and legal considerations of the right structure for a common business enterprise and the documents. But it's worth touching on. So at the one end of the spectrum, you might have a simple partnership, and we all know common liability, so the guy on the left can get the guy on the right in trouble and all the issues that come there. But for a lot of small businesses, it's a good way to start. Then we've got the sort of the small, medium-sized business structure where we've got a couple of entities, maybe a couple of trusts going into partnership together, or a company and a trust. And then we sort of start to move towards the sort of medium-sized, well-advised small business people or medium business people, which you've now created fixed interests through this concept of a company or a unit trust. And then finally, when you get to a certain size, companies are really the only viable option to, particularly if you've got a number of people coming into a common business enterprise. And obviously if liability is an issue, you want to have the company in there. But I'm not going to go into that in any huge detail because that's probably a discussion for another day. So let's say we've got someone who's got a company and somebody's set up a business with a fixed trust and they want to put those things together. So in that context, we've got a fixed interest in a fixed trust and we've got a fixed interest in a company. So it's quite easy to bring those things together. So what usually happens is the company or the unit trust might take over the units and the other people are granted an interest in the holding or the head company. But if we've got a sort of a more traditional smaller business structure where we've got these unfixed trusts, discretionary trusts, then our only option is for the business itself to be taken over. So we've got an asset sale there versus an entity sale in the first instance. So once again, we're not going to go into a whole thing about that, but it's just a good thing to touch on. Another thing to think about when choosing a structure is governance. So the decision-making processes, the responsibility, the checks and balances. And I think once again, sometimes we overemphasise the tax elements of our structure and we don't think about what are the consequences for the ongoing governance of it. And in relation to a company, you set up, just by setting up a company, you get the Corporations Act imported for free. So oppression of minorities, certain decisions that require certain percentages of people to be involved. You get the structure of a separation of ownership and management just by virtue of directors and equity or shareholders. So you get a lot of free import into your business structure by going with a company. The Partnership Act, so if you've got two companies, you've got the Corporations Act, but then you've also got the Partnership Act. That's a state act that each of the states have. And once again, there's obligations, fiduciary obligations, thinking about your fellow business partners, reporting. There's a number of things. It's worth actually having a bit of a browse through the Partnership Act and the Trustee Act. Because if you've got a trust involved in your structure, you've also imported all the trust concepts, both the common law or equity principles as well as the trustee acts of each state. So I think if you're going to go into business and you're going to do it well and you're going to do it seriously, you need to actually understand all these particular things that you're importing into your business relationship just by virtue of the structure that you choose to go with. And then documenting the structure. So really the documentation follows the structure. So if you've got a company, you don't necessarily use, you don't use a partnership agreement, you use a shareholders agreement or a constitution. If you've got a partnership, you need a partnership agreement, and so on. So really that's going to flow from that structure choice. But I think this is the second bit that a lot of people overlook, is that things like loan agreements, employment terms between the people, so you've got this concept of being an owner and being a participant in the business, and IP licenses. If someone's bringing intellectual property into it, there should be a license there. And when these things are overlooked and the partnership fails, then somebody says, okay, well, I'd like my loan repaid, thank you. Well, it's 600 grand, the business doesn't have 600 grand. We can't repay it at the time. Well, the terms are tax call. And now I want interest because I'm paying interest to my bank, and my tax guys told me that I can't get a deduction for that interest because the business isn't paying me any interest. Well, we didn't agree on that. So they're the sort of discussions. So if someone comes to me and wants to blow up a partnership, that's the sort of things I look for. I don't look for the first things. I first of all say, well, have you got a loan into the partnership? Are you employed by the partnership? And have you made any other contributions where you haven't assigned IP and that sort of stuff, so we can start to attack it in that respect. So if you're planning for something that's going to be durable and it's going to have a pleasant exit, then really it's those agreements associated with those other inputs that I think are as important, if not more important, than what people traditionally look for. A little sort of hobby horse of mine is if you've got a company, whether you use a shareholders agreement or a constitution, and I personally have gone very much towards using a constitution and moving away from shareholders agreements, because traditionally you'd have the shareholders agreement between the shareholders and perhaps the company, and then the company itself would have a single constitution, and you'd have a provision in the shareholders agreement that says that the extent of any inconsistency the shareholder agreement applies, and then something happens, you take it into your lawyer, I've got this problem, and they're trying to work out, how this actually all comes together and what your rights and obligations are. Whereas if you use a constitution, you get a couple of really cool things. The first thing is that if you become a shareholder in a company, you're automatically bound by all the terms of that constitution. It's called a statutory contract. So even if you die and your shares go to your next of kin, they don't have to sign a deed of adherence, or there's this gap between receiving the shares from inheritance but haven't signed the partnership agreement, the shareholders agreement. A lot of shareholders agreement don't get signed by everybody, so people come and go. The other thing the Constitution does is it binds both the shareholders and directors. So if you put something in a Constitution that says directors can act in a certain way, then if they act in that way, and it would ordinarily be contrary to a duty or something like that, if you've agreed in the Constitution, the directors get a free pass. Whereas if you agreed in a shareholders agreement, it actually doesn't override the corporations law, and the directors can actually be acting in accordance with the shareholders agreement, which gives them no cover. And as far as just practical governance, it's a single place to find the rules of your common business enterprise. So I think spending time on getting the constitutions right is really worthwhile. But the takeaway here is that no matter what legal structure you adopt, companies, unit trusts, not just partnerships, you're putting your trust in other people. So it's not just a matter of, I'm not using a partnership, therefore, so-and-so can't do whatever. Ultimately, if you come together, there has to be that element of trust, which is so important. This is why it's important to get that purpose right at the beginning and understand the goals and values of the people that you're going into business with.